So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 24th RiskMinds conference. I've been coming to RiskMinds pretty much every year since it first started. It's been very interesting to see how the agenda has evolved over that time, more of which in just a minute. I'll keep my opening remarks quite brief because I know you're very keen to hear what the panel has to say. Firstly, I'd just like to say that apparently, although the slide said 650 plus attendees, I'm told that over 700 people have registered for the conference this year, which is a record. So that's fantastic. So once again, welcome everybody. I just want to pick up a couple of themes from yesterday for those of you who attended the session, the regulatory summit. I think inevitably there was quite a lot of discussion around the expected changes to Basel III. We have to remember, by the way, it's not Basel IV. We were told that once again very clearly yesterday by the Basel Committee. These are amendments to Basel III, with some big announcements coming out on Thursday this week. So I think we'll all be looking forward to that. I think another key thing that came out of yesterday was that the implications of the whole reg change agenda and the way the different aspects of that agenda are going to interplay with each other. So whether it's risk-based capital, whether it's leverage ratio, but also some of the other themes such as MiFID and so on. And I think there was certainly a strong feeling that we haven't yet really understood what the implications of the intersect of those different changes are going to be. We probably understand each one of them individually, but what they'll mean collectively is something that I think we don't yet fully understand. There was quite a lot of talk around supervisory trends and maybe a bit of a rebalancing, that going from perhaps a less intrusive approach more back to a more principles-based approach, at least in some parts of the world, which I'm sure will be heartening to some of you. But I think most importantly, and this kicks off what we're going to be talking about today, is very much the need to be focusing on the risks that can hurt us going forward, as opposed to the more traditional risks that we've typically looked at in the industry. And I think my observation, having been coming to this conference, as I said, for almost every year of the 24 years, is how the role of the Chief Risk Officer has really changed quite remarkably over that period. And I think especially over the past few years. I think even up until 3, 4, 5 years ago, we were still talking very much about the implications of the post-crisis regulatory reform agenda and all the things that came through there. But if you look at the agenda for the past few years, there's been a lot more talk around some of the newer risks, cyber in particular, conduct, those kind of issues. And I think in a way, those kind of risks are, in a sense, perhaps a little bit more threatening to us because they're harder to understand, and it's harder to appreciate sometimes what the implications of them are going to be. So I think the evolution of the agenda does reflect that. We've got a very exciting agenda ahead of us today. And I'm very pleased that actually if you look at the agenda for today, it's taking an even broader perspective. So we're going to be kicking off with what keeps the CRO awake at night. I hope you all had a good night's sleep, by the way, and weren't kept awake too long. But looking at FinTech, looking at the future of the business model, and perhaps even whether the business model as we currently know it even has, will continue to exist in 10 years' time. So I think it's going to be a very interesting and very challenging program today. So I, for one, are very much looking forward to it. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first panel session of the day. Mark Faulkner, who's the co-founder of Credit Benchmark, is going to be moderating the panel. I will leave it up to Mark to hand over and to introduce his fellow panelists. What I'm not going to do today, by the way, is read everyone's biography out to you. It's available in the app, the RiskMinds app. I don't want to bore you. I don't want to waste time by doing that. So apologize for the brief introduction, Mark, but over to you.
Thank you. Just so I can keep to time.
Oh, sure. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Oh, is that? Yes, exactly.
Do you want the agenda?
Yes. Oh, sorry. There you go. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you, Chris, for the introduction. The briefer, the better. What I'd like to do is ask my panel to just introduce themselves very briefly and just go down the line, starting with Daniel in a moment. But I feel for you. You were seated to loud music, and it told you to turn your phones off. And the first thing that happened is we asked you to register on a website to vote. So I would encourage you, if you can, to go to slido.com using the password RiskMinds to register so we can engage you in some questions that we've got that are relevant to the panel. So please go on your browser to slido.com, the password RiskMinds, all lowercase. And whilst you're doing that, I'll just ask the panel to just briefly introduce themselves. Daniel.
I'm Daniel Moore, the CRO of Scotiabank in Toronto, Canada.
Hi, I'm Lewis O'Donnell. I'm the CRO for Nomura.
I'm Jean-Jacques van Helten. I'm the Chief Risk Officer for EMEA for Bank of Montreal in Europe.
Hi, my name is Steven van Rijswijk. I'm the CRO of ING Bank.
Good morning, I'm Mark Smith. I'm the Chief Risk Officer of Standard Chartered.
Thank you all very much. Could we please have the first question up on the slide so we can see what the audience is thinking? What we're asking you is, in your view, which of the following areas presents the biggest risk to your organization today? If you just vote as quickly as you can, we'll start to drive the session by that. We also had the benefit of a survey that RiskMinds conducted some time ago, and that's the basis on which we prepared. So if you're radically different from that survey, it's going to be quite interesting to see how the panelists take their orders here. Well, wonderful. I'm glad that other isn't the major one, because that would make life very difficult for us all. We agreed that we wouldn't all vote for other, didn't we, gentlemen?
We did agree that.
Right, I'm just going to it looks like it's stabilizing, and you can all see the results there. I think the biggest, gentlemen, you can probably see it in the panels in front of you here. Cybersecurity was in the previous survey the number one thing that was of gravest concern to you. So my first question is safe. However, oh yes, regulatory change. A late mover there was second, and then it was geopolitical instability, but has now been overtaken by risk culture and FinTech digitization. So a few of you still voting, but let's kick off, if I may, with you, Daniel. Cybersecurity, it was in the survey, it is in the room, and I think when we briefed for this session, a significant risk that, I'm not sure it keeps you awake at night, but let's get to that later. How does it play out in your mind? And perhaps you could help distinguish cybersecurity in a retail context for banks with cybersecurity in a wholesale context for banks, because there does seem to be a different experience going on. Over to you, sir.
Well, I make the first observation that credit risk comes out at 5%, Mark. And yet, banks only have two defenses against risk, really, two tools at their disposal. One is adjustments to the income statement through reserves, and then two is to set aside capital. And we have most of us have 80 to 85% of our capital set aside for credit risk, and yet it's only on 5% of our minds here, which is a fascinating observation.
Yes.
So cybersecurity clearly should be number one, because we've all watched Zero Day and Snowden and Terminator and any other number of scary movies that bring it to front of mind about what the future would look like for us. And recent surveys would show that it would be at 70% of CROs would put it at the top of their list, 70% of board members would put it at the top of their list. And it feels like it ought to be top of the list because it feels like a never-ending arms race. It feels like we need to build our walls higher and the bad guys build their ladders higher yet, and never-ending, and it seems unwinnable. And I think the critical realization around cyber risk, Mark, is to realize that you do need to build the bigger wall around your perimeter, but that's not sufficient. The perimeter is vast. You need to determine where you're hiding your crown jewels and build stronger defenses, put the vault around the crown jewels. And you also need to have a strong practice, Mark, around what you do to detect that someone's breached your wall and how you're going to respond and recover once they're over the wall. And frankly, that makes a difference between someone nicking a flower out of your garden and someone shooting your dog at the end of the day.
Right, okay. The SWIFT experience does show that wholesale cybersecurity risk is tangible and real, etc. But is it more of a phenomenon at the retail sector, on the retail side of banking? Any thoughts on that? Go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah.
It seems at least to be the case that it is. At least there are many more entry points in terms of the retail client base than there are in the wholesale space. What you there see is that the number of attacks have increased dramatically over the past 5 years. I believe that this year there are 20 times as much as attacks than there were 5 years ago. At the same point in time, there's also much more information available. So we have, for example, a cybersecurity center in Leeuwarden. We mimic attacks all the time. We look at what comes in from clients, and basically there are many scientists working on writing rules to prevent e-fraud happening. So there's also much more experience. If you look at, I come back to the first speaker in terms of the number of assets that we are having and the ones that are critical assets, the first time that we did that assessment, we just missed a number of assets that we consider to be critical. And there is the unknown, as I would call it, in the wholesale space, because a number of these critical assets are in the wholesale banking space, first and foremost in the payment space, whereby you need to make sure that you address for these assets, that you secure these assets, that you do pen tests on these assets as well, because that is currently relatively untested compared to the retail space.
Yeah, I just want to add to that for we at Bank of Montreal, we're divided effectively into 3 different areas. We've got what we call the ransomware, cryptographic. We've got the denial of critical service, and then last but not least, the payment systems. And I think it's the payment systems from a wholesale perspective that we spent quite a bit of focus on. And clearly, you know, the attention that this reflects is also mirrored at the board. So, you know, we now have to, or at least I have to troop up every quarter, if not more often, at the risk management committees, walking through what we are doing on cybersecurity. It's come very, very high in the, and also thematic reviews by the regulators. So you get pushed from all sides to, you know, report and be cognizant of what you are doing in terms of offsets.
Because cybersecurity risk is a risk, does it fall within the area of responsibility of a chief risk officer, or have you got a cybersecurity risk management peer that's in the IT reporting line? I'm just curious as to whether it falls inside your world or outside.
Fortunately, that is not on my plate. Along this.
Fortunately or unfortunately?
Fortunately, cybersecurity is not on my plate. Having said that, as the chair of the risk management committee, clearly it is reported up through that. We do have our own resources dedicated, and it's an integrated 24/7 approach following the sun, as it were, for the bank's operations globally.
Whereas we have a very distinct first line and second line approach. So the second line sort of risk overseer of cybersecurity is part of my team. Our biggest challenge, I think, is, and maybe we're behind other banks, I don't know, but it's very much engaging with the front line businesses for them to understand that they need to identify their critical assets, their key data, and the steps that they can take. It isn't just a technical problem that sits in the IT organisation. It has to be much broader across the organisation.
Lewis, is it part of your world, or just a colleague that you meet in the risk management committee?
In our world, we see it at the risk management committee, yes. So we have the sort of first line defence of cyber is done by a group in IT, and then the oversight of cyber is done by operational risk. This is obviously a critical risk, right?
Okay.
I would all agree with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
We're going to try and encourage your participation from the audience. Every moderator and panel tries to do that. If anybody has any pressing questions, just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you, but we'll also make some time at the end of the session for questions. Regulatory change, number 2 in the poll of the audience. It was number 2 in the previous survey. However, we will be sort of in respect to others who are going to be delving into this in more depth, perhaps being slightly lighter touch in this area. The front page of the FT today about the Brexit border in Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland breakdown at the moment. You can't keep Mr. Trump off the front pages. How does another area of non-financial risk that you can't necessarily manage and measure and control within your sort of structured worlds play into your thinking, and does it keep you awake at night, Stefan? Geopolitical risk.
Geopolitical risk. Okay. You were talking about non-financial risk. I was like, well, what is non-financial risk? What is non-financial about this? Well, does it keep me awake at night? What I find with these geopolitical risks is I find them all very idiosyncratic. And this morning also during the breakfast, we talked about North Korea, and there was the former head of MI5 discussing, as part of that breakfast, also about North Korea. And over the past number of months, I've spoken to more specialists about North Korea than ever in my complete life before. And still after that, all of these discussions, I'm puzzled. Do I now need to do something or not? And that goes for a number of these idiosyncratic risks, including Brexit, for example, although I think it's of a completely different magnitude than what we see in the Korean Peninsula. But because they have not happened very often, to say the least, it is a very binomial decisions that you need to take in terms of whether you deal with those risks or not. And that does keep me awake at night, because the chance of these threats materializing is extremely small. But if they do, the potential impact is potentially very big, and it could potentially harm us and kill us. So I find it a very significant risk, and what you actually see also with the public and social media phenomenon occurring, you see bigger spikes of things flaring up on the global arena and then lying down again. And in terms of our stress testing, we spend increasingly more time on a quarterly basis in terms of looking at particular instabilities in the world and stress testing that. So yes.
It's interesting you said sort of when you're confronted with these risks, you know, am I meant to do something about them? Yes, no. And then if so, yes, what? Yeah. And I suppose what you've said there is you factor in as best you can in the stress testing and the checks and balances that you run within the organization. Does that logic follow?
Yeah, it is. But the question, of course, is what is a worst case scenario? And again, I was talking about Korea, and you speak to people from embassies and military personnel and military specialists and geopolitical experts, and they sketch you the very black pictures of what could potentially happen. And so how do you stress test for that? Because these things are all scenarios, and the good things that these scenarios do is they present you with imperfect representation of the world, and they're all untrue. So which one do you now pick, and do you choose the worst of the worst to base your decision upon, which basically with a 99.99% interval will never happen. But if it does, you have a problem. And what do you then do?
Is that train of thought follow through in the other panelists' minds?
Well, I think you can do something about. I mean, I think it's important to try and get to grips with these types of risks. I mean, obviously, working for a Japanese bank, perhaps it's more front and center for us. But trying to plan for scenarios, trying to understand that sort of risk curve in a sense of likelihood events versus the extremeness of those events, trying to make sure you're positioned so that you can survive it to some degree, except perhaps for the sort of legendary sort of nuclear attack on Tokyo type effect, which clearly would be a very different style of planning you're using for that type of event. I do think you'll gain insight into the way you take risks, the way you deal with positions, and you can actually take actions which can help mitigate the extent of a disaster caused by North Korea in some of the more extreme scenarios. So I think it's worth doing. I think we definitely sort of carried out that procedure, thinking about stress tests, thinking about the ranges of events, and generally we've created we had a system of several stress tests of the South Korea effects, which we then added to a sort of very terrible scenario onto, and just considered that endpoint. Is this likely? No, but I think it gives us resilience as an organisation in that area, so it's helpful in that way. But we do have to weigh that against the cost of the business we decline, or the cost of hedging the business we do.
Yeah, I mean, the other aspect of this, I think, is that if you do that sort of exercise, it enables you to start your contingency planning. So some of the actions you might take, you don't necessarily take today, but if you've thought through the different scenarios and the different consequences, you know, you have a game plan. You know, if this happens, and this is how we'd react, and this is what we would do. And so building out a playbook, even if you tear it up on day one because the the script is different to what you expected, having gone through the exercise 2 or 3 times, I think you can manage that big event in a better way.
Some of these events are so large, and they're not just banking issues, they're classically global issues. They occupy the minds of the politicians and everybody in the world. Do you as banks have experience and of any engagement, lobbying, communication with government? Is there a channel there that influence and concerns can be shared? Obviously, you can't influence politicians, heaven forbid, but is there a means by which the bank can at least express reservations and concerns and worst-case scenarios and share that with the politicians? Are those channels open?
I'm sure they are. We often talk to them about how it would not be a good idea to leave Brexit, but
And do they do anything with it?
and they don't do anything with it either. So there you go. But I think just pick up a point. I mean, these sort of scenarios as they take place. So it's more the backdrop that I look at these from a risk perspective. And in my mind, we're right now at a point where we are looking at some considerable asset bubbles globally. I think we're at peak of cycle. We have very, very low volatility. I think there's some real stresses and strains in the international financial system. And so what was happening in North Korea may, not that I'm suggesting that it's not significant, but the amplification of the impact of such events is probably far greater in what is, in my mind, an increasingly febrile financial system. We are the degree of low volatility, in particular, is something that is now that I see across all asset classes. Is one that, with the exception of Bitcoin, but that's a bubble, you see. And so you look at yourself, you think, well, that's not that level of low volatility we haven't really seen since the days of Bitcoin. A mispricing of assets. You look at spreads in the bond market; they're as tight as they've been since 2007. I think that those are the kind of things that keeps me awake, because then on top of that, something that may be happening in North Korea will just be the nudging, the pushing that'll get the whole thing moving.
I think that's a really interesting thing. I would imagine if we polled the room, right, majority of people would believe that there is a moderate to large bubble in credit prices, assets, and the possibility of some deflation of that bubble in the next couple of years, right? As we know, we should sort of look at history. We can tell it could be tomorrow or 2 years' time, or maybe longer, right? Bubbles have a nature of not being predictable when they burst. So as risk officers, we do have to make sure that we can be we can survive such a deflation of an asset bubble. The sort of expected deflation of an asset bubble must be a scenario that we are comfortable going into. So that's not what stops me sleeping at night. It's not that I necessarily don't sleep at night. I think we're sort of thinking about the sort of level and types of risks we deal with. If you think about it, the risks we don't sleep at night for are the ones we know about, which are tail, which are hard to deal with. And so the credit bubble is something which we are playing scenarios about, stress testing for, getting everyone organised about, thinking about the way we take on credit, wondering about our mortgage books, whatever, depending which area we're in.
Yeah.
North Korea is almost too extreme in its positive thing. It's sort of you can prepare your exposure to the region to some degree, but probably not completely as much as you want. You probably have to stay engaged in the business, so that's clearly a risk that might stop you sleeping at night if you have a significant piece in the region. But I think that's why cybersecurity is a known risk. You see that it can have a massive reputational damage. That's very important. But some of these other on this list are also in that category. Risk culture and conduct, I think, is really serious there. If we see the thing I worry about is the bubble bursting plus other effects, right? So it's the other effects that make me think about how we can increase our sort of independence from effect from it. I think the chance of regulators causing more fines, more questions about conduct, and the way we have interacted with, the finer mesh that we might look for conflicts in our business could cause us significant problems. Because I think there's still areas where we as banks and operations and people have to think about how we make that conflict almost zero.
I agree with that observation. I'd say, on this list, risk culture isn't so much a threat as it is our strongest defense against any of the other threats. And I think one of the biggest threats that we have, if we're to look past page 1 and 3 of the FT this morning and move on beyond North Korea and Brexit and all those things that make for great cocktail conversation, one of the biggest threats that we have is the fact that we have 700 people signed up for the RiskMinds International Conference. It's a burgeoning industry, and there's lots to worry about. And there's never been a more employable career set than being in risk. And the taxonomy of risks has grown exponentially to basically include everything that a CEO would have worried about before.
Well, it's definitely sexy. Smoke machines, loud
Smoke
music,
machines, rock
flashing
music on the
lights,
walk
you know.
on.
You're the new rock and roll guys, yeah?
And what that's led to is an explosion of cost within the risk infrastructure. And I would include the compliance and AML infrastructure amongst that. Now, a lot of that has been necessary as a response to the post-crisis world. But I think our challenge to everyone here today in this room is to try and take the infrastructure that we've built and make it sustainable from a cost basis, because the ROEs in industry are not sustainable on a go-forward basis. Yeah. And how do we take the technology that we built in a post-crisis world and use it to run banks more cost-effectively and more forward-looking going forward?
I've never seen so many nodding heads there, so Stefan, you've got something to add.
Exactly. So yeah. No, but I mean, I don't know whether it's risk culture or regulatory change or maybe a bit both, or societal change, if you will. But the focus of society on the way that we as banks behave, or the duty of care that society feels that we as a bank should have, is changing over time. And if you look at compliance or KYC or duty of care or MiFID or all those regulations, they all come also from a societal view in terms of what our role should be. If we look back currently at practices that which we employed 5 or 10 years ago, these would not be or less acceptable currently. And the big question is, we need to think actually 5 years ahead to be able to see what would be out there that we now think would not be acceptable in 5 years anymore. And that's a very difficult task. But there you actually see back what you call the tail end of the risk is the unknown unknowns. What are things that we're currently employing that we should not be doing? And we're increasingly confronted with things, and we need to reflect on ourselves in terms of what are we actually doing. Is this fit for purpose with the client base that we currently have?
Any examples that you could give that you think might fall into that category of things you shouldn't be doing 5 years from now?
Sell derivatives to a large part of the population at all.
Right.
Advise on investments.
Here's an example. So we were just thinking about Venezuela and the auction in the Venezuela CDS auction. I think we are players in the auction. We're parts of ISDA. We're sort of helping organize the approach to the legal framework. We probably should try and separate these things more clearly. I think ISDA do a good job of it, actually, but I think we should probably be even more clear about these things. Because there is clearly, we as banks have exposures. We as banks have almost an oversight function at some level. We as banks are sitting in committees to decide on defaults. We as banks are
Interesting. Are you arguing potentially for rigid, stronger barriers between different departments within banks, or having different banks do different things?
I'm not. I haven't solved this question.
Glass-Steagall for the 21st century.
I think we can. I'm thinking about FinTech here, and I'm thinking that that's actually not necessarily to be thought of as a threat, but as an enabler. And I'm thinking of RegTech, where we actually use the algorithms and the analysis that's come out of the FinTech world to deal with the sort of the regulatory issues that I deal with. For example, the other day I was looking at trying to map through the requirements that in the UK we have to operate under BPRU and EPRU requirements. And when you parse that out, you have something like 1,200 to 1,300 particular rules that you need to follow, or mapping that you can do in order to make sure that you're in full compliance. And it seems to me that in a very short order, instead of employing PwC at some considerable cost to do the work for me, I can actually get RegTech, FinTech to do that. And I think it's the same in a lot of the processes and operational risks, for example, and the reporting of that in order to build out the database, which will then assist you in where you're going to put your reg capital and so forth. I think, there are a lot of changes coming down the track about parts of risk that we will not have to be doing in the future, but we will do having done for us by embracing and enabling FinTech to come in and assist us.
Then why, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the response, then why is 17% of the audience saying that FinTech and digitization is one of the largest risks that they face? Is it to their job security?
Ask them.
Go on. Well, I don't know. Who voted that FinTech and... Name yourself. And show of hands, FinTech and digitization, biggest risk to the organisation? There's only one. I'm going to ask you a question. If you don't. Can we get a microphone to this gentleman, please? It's coming. It's just so everybody can hear. What were you thinking, sir?
What were you thinking?
Yeah, so I'm Kripa from Metonymy Labs, and I am one of the FinTech players. So I think it's the biggest risk because I don't think banks actually understand how big this is going to get. And I had a follow-up question maybe, which is...
Go ahead, sir.
This thing here reflects sentiment. How does this reflect budget?
Ooh.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Show me where the money is, gentlemen.
That's one of the really interesting things. To try and marry up sentiment and polls with budget tends to be very, very interesting indeed. Because if you think about it, we probably spend a reasonable amount on credit risk, in fact, in terms of the budget we spend on every day. That, by the way, does tend to reduce the sentiment of a thing that will threaten us as a thing we worry about, so sleeping. So it's not quite a one-for-one. But we tend to, we also do where we look at the big risks that people are worrying about in the world, and that will generally give a higher weighting for operational credit and market. So give a slightly more budget-style weighting. But you'll generally find that cybersecurity, relative to the amount we spend on it, is underrepresented. That what you might call FinTech, digitization, and perhaps business model, business choices, is larger risks than we spend money on, because it's more of a strategy thinking approach that's meant to solve that. Risk culture is generally quite a massive risk, and we are all trying to sort of do it in our spare time a bit. Well, that's a bit unfair, but we're not putting as much budget into culture change, people, and other aspects that we would to market risk. So I think that budget question is an interesting one. It is one that's worth doing if you haven't done it.
But I'd push back on that. I think most banks now, cybersecurity, if you put cybersecurity and FinTech together, and in some ways they belong together because it's all under the budget of the CTO plus some second line spend, that's a massive spend for most banks. That would represent most banks' spend these days. It does for us, certainly, and one that we're paying a lot of attention to. I don't think FinTech is a risk. I think the risk is standing still. FinTech's an opportunity. The risk is not using it.
Yeah, the risk is business model, really.
Yeah.
Mark, I mean, is that consistent with your
just
thinking?
picking up what Daniel said earlier, because it's not only is FinTech, I think, an opportunity, but also risk culture, as Daniel said. I think that is our biggest defense against so many of these other challenges we face. And if you're continually focusing on preventing a bad risk culture as opposed to encouraging a good one, I think you're in danger of not reaping the benefits of the 95% plus people in your organization who generally want to do the right thing and want to have the right approach. And really finding ways to encourage and support them, I think, is one of the best approaches that a bank can have. And that can't just be within the risk function. It has to be across the wider organization.
I mean, if coming back to digitization, I think digitization can help us greatly in risk management. And when you talk both about underwriting models or pricing models or regulatory models or control models in the fraud and the non-financial risk space, I mean, it enables you to, in a world which is digitized in any case and in which we process 3 billion payments. I mean, if you want to look at these payments in a consistent risk-based methodology, I mean, digitization will help us greatly in building models and building control models and monitoring models to focus on that percentage that we, from a risk point of view, perceive more risky. So in that sense, it can be very helpful. And I mean, I've been a member of the Global Credit Committee for a number of years, and when I first came to that meeting, I always tell a story, also internally, so why not share it with the world? On Thursday evening, I would then read 15 credit packages of about 100 pages each. So I would come home and have dinner and bring my kids to bed and then start reading. And it was about 3 o'clock at night, and I was halfway through, and then reading very quickly. And then I was like, I can't take this anymore. And the next morning at 9 o'clock, you would have that meeting. So the next morning, I would be in that meeting, and this was 4 or 5 years ago. And then everybody, and in 1 hour, we would discuss those 15 credit packs, and everybody would have an opinion about all these credit packs. And I was extremely impressed by all these people. I was like, wow, these people are so smart. How can they read it? But after a month, I decided to only start reading as of page 45. So the next day, the chairman said, the first package, this is my opinion. Does anybody have an opinion? I would raise my hand and say, well, I have a question on page 45. And then you would see the whole room, and it would like, wow, this guy. So, that's how I became the CRO. So, but the point is, a number of these credit packs, in terms of using early warning signals, you can much better focus on where the risk really is than all do it on a very a personal base. So I think that can help tremendously.
But I think that raises a related point. We look at that list, and I don't know the background of everybody on this panel, but I'm guessing most of us, if we had to choose how we got to do the job we do, is through the credit route. Certainly the case for me might be market risk. And yet, if you look at the percentages of where we think the problems are, I think there's a real question of actually whether we've got the right people as chief risk officers to properly manage this risk. And I'm not trying to do us out of a job, gentlemen, but I think it is something that banks as a whole need to think about. You know, what does a chief risk officer look like going forward?
It's almost like
Retirement
a careers advisory session. Yeah.
Can I come back to one other point? Because the gentleman asked, what do you spend most money on? And I mean, in the end, it's about total cost of ownership. So these risks are being run by the organization as a whole, not by risk management. So if you, for example, look at credit losses and collections in that regard, I mean, collections with us is in the first line. Now, if I leave this to a head of operations, and I jokingly always say that, is that what that person will do, they will bring down the collection department to zero, because then you minimize the cost of collections, but you then maximize the cost of credit risk, right? So the same goes with cybersecurity. I mean, I'm responsible for cyber and IT risk in a non-financial risk space, but most of the money is burned or spent, if you will, to Daniel's point, in the first line. And so in that sense, you need to look at the total cost of ownership, not only at the costs that are being used in risk management. I mean, we have hundreds of credit risk officers, but the largest cost of risk there is the money that we lose based on losses in the tail end in the credit risk. And so that's the way you would weigh it. In general, I would say that more and more time and money is spent in the non-financial risk space compared to 5 years ago. Tremendous shift.
Thank you. Could I please have the second question, please? This will look remarkably familiar. What we wanted to try and assess was, based upon this short conversation, whether any of your opinions had changed. So please do vote again, and we'll comment on. Now, if they haven't, we will have full respect of your focus and determination. If they have, I will be in awe of my panel. Whilst you're voting, we really haven't reached every one of these topics. MiFID, Basel IV, 3, whatever one agrees, FRTB, regulation is a huge issue in life, in banking, in risk management. Is it the intended consequences or the unintended consequences that gives you biggest cause for concern? Lewis?
Oh my goodness.
I'm just while they're voting, because it took a little bit of time.
The intended consequences, the unintended consequences of regulatory change. Most people would be probably thinking in terms of regulatory change. There's a span of work that's required to be done, and the ability to do that and make sure that they were, keep making sure they were under the regulatory regimes as they're meant to be. So that's probably what most people mean by that piece. Yet the risk we have, probably the not sleep risk, is that question of unintended consequences, changes to business models, outcomes where a particular regulation turns out to have a very significant impact on some particularity of our banks or your banks. If you think about it, one of the biggest changes in the recent sort of 4 to 5 years has been banks focusing on what they feel they're good at. But that means they're much more exposed to particularities of regulation. And so this is, in that sense, a sleep at night question, but it's the unintended consequences of those regulations, or at least if they are intended, not expected.
Yeah.
But by the way, I think other is really important.
Lewis, you're
well.
affecting the poll. It would seem that regulatory risk is driving. Keep talking, sir. Let's go.
So to another point, other is really important here as well. If you think about the things that we sleep at night about which we shouldn't, sort of that falls in the other box, right? So a classic risk which you sleep at night about but you shouldn't is where you get used to living by the volcano. Okay. Now that's a metaphoric volcano in this case. So hopefully the vote will now go out. But
just expand on regulatory change for a second. I think from my perspective, there are 3 things that really make for a safe and sound banking system. One is to have a prudential, forward-looking regulator that can anticipate change and work with the industry to be responsive. 2 is an agile, non-rigid banking system. And 3 is a diverse business model, which is the only defense against unforeseen, the unknown consequences, the only real defense. And my concern is that the increased regulation, which we've had for 10 years coming at us and continues to come at us, makes for a less agile and, through balkanization of banking, less agile, less diverse business model of banks. And so I think that is certainly something that should be front of mind for most of us.
a weirdly semi-intended consequence, perhaps. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, another consequence is that when these regulations come at you and you try and the embedding of them and then the living of them is a much more protracted and, dare I say, challenging process, because you have to go through review and challenge. Are you actually doing what you say you're doing? To what extent is that then embedded indeed in the culture of the firm? Because it's very easy to do your ICAP or your ILAP whenever you have to do it and then put it on the shelf and potentially not look at it for another year when you have to do it again. So it's actually bringing it down and living it on a day-to-day basis and making sure that it's embedded and people actually act against the requirements that are set upon them. That's actually quite I find that quite a challenge, and it ties into risk culture as well. In that sense.
But that gets to almost another some of the regulations and the purpose of them. I think that's a good part. I mean, a terrible part perhaps in terms of cost and expense and time. But it has good outcomes from a sort of compliance and conduct point of view. Actually, that's almost the positive side of the regulation.
Gentlemen, you mentioned time as you're talking there, and time waits for no man or woman. We are about to conclude our session. In fact, we've run slightly over. You have, or maybe some people just find out how to log in. We've changed the order. Well done, congratulations. We weren't entirely sure whether we would. And in some instances, the devil in the detail, but I'm sure the organisers will be able to share the pre and post discussion outputs, but regulatory change, maybe because we were talking about it as the vote was going on, is now the largest concern. But credit risk has certainly come up significantly, very significantly.
What would be interesting to understand better from the audience is it regulatory change in terms of IFRS, TRIM, Basel IV, or is it more code of conduct rules that are changing and the way that the regulator is perceiving that?
I feel another session coming on.
So we'll stay here for the next 45 minutes to talk.
We'll get to we're not going to lock the doors. We would like to thank the organisers for giving us the opportunity, the sponsors for making this possible, you for your attention, and I'd like you to join and thank the panellists. Thank you very much. Thank you.